Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another episode in CPD in 43. Today is our September event, which is coming from UCL in London, ESG, Sustainable Finance and the Built Environment, from Dr. Kell Jones. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Kell, and as usual, we'll come back with a Q&A session in about half an hour, and then we'll also run through the other events that are due to take place up to the end of the year. So I will hand it straight over, and as usual, I'll disappear into the background. But if there's any questions, please do ask them in the chat box. Those will be fielded towards the end of the event during the Q&A session.
Perfect. Thank you, Usman. Just get my screen going. Okay, hopefully that's up and running now. So hello, and thank you all for having me. It's great to see so many people here today. I'm Kell Jones from the Bartlett School of Sustainable Construction, part of UCL, and going to be talking to you today about ESG, mostly sustainable finance, and how they relate to the built environment. Broad agenda for you is there'll be a quick word on ESG and why you need to be thinking about it, or why your clients need to be thinking about it. The bulk of the conversation will be about sustainable finance itself. What is it? How does it manifest? What can you do with it? And then I'll wrap up with 3 ways that you might think about trying to drive change on your projects using sustainable finance and other policy levers in that sort of space around ESG. So I'm here as Kell Jones, part of UCL, but I'm just going to give you a very quick background into who I am. I'm a recovering accountant. I'm also formerly a BREEAM accredited professional, and I used to be part of the Institute of Architectural Technologists and a BIM manager. And so in my career, I have tried to bring together my 3 themes: sustainability, finance, and architectural design, to help advance the transition of the built environment to a low carbon context. More recently, that's manifested as me doing an engineering doctorate on material innovations on construction projects, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. I was the building standards manager for the Climate Bonds Initiative, where I wrote the standard for how we assess what a sustainable building is from a climate bonds perspective. And now I'm the lecturer in construction procurement and supply chain management at the Bartlett School of Sustainable Construction. So that's me. I'm also deputy director of a group within the school who look at sort of environmental, social and governance aspects of the built environment and the law. And as part of that work last year, we did a report with Puma Property Finance looking at ESG in the real estate finance sector. Now, I put a QR code on there. You can download it now or later. There's another one at the end, so don't worry about grabbing your phone. The key things that I want to talk about here on this slide is that for many developers, especially small developers, they don't really think about the environmental, social and governance aspects of what they're doing. And you can understand why. They've got plenty of other things to do. It's going to take their attention away from delivering the things that they're trying to deliver. But in the course of the work we were doing to pull this thing together, it became clear that the regulations are coming. And while you may not see a direct impact on your clients, designers, project teams, there will be an indirect impact. So legislation that's being imposed at the European level is going to impact the entire supply chain. So even if you're a little SME, you're going to have to provide information up that pipeline. And so while you might all think that your organization's clients might think this isn't something that's important to me, it only affects big companies, it will come and impact you. And that's the context within which this whole conversation is happening today. We need to prepare ourselves for this. The question becomes whether you want to preempt the changes that are coming, get ready for them, or whether you want to react and run around at the end when they land directly on your doorstep. That's all I'm going to say on ESG for now. If there are specific areas you want me to talk about there, we can do that. The bulk of what I'm going to be talking about is finance and how finance and ESG are interrelated and how they're delivered onto construction projects and real estate generally. So the first thing to talk about is how do we finance the built environment? You can see from this slide that there are multiple life cycle stages for a building when you may need debt finance or you may need finance. During the development phase, refinancing once you've sold it, generally through the ownership and operation of it and the refurbishment of it. And so each of those life cycle stages may require an investment. And typically, the majority of that investment will come through debt. Some companies will use a degree of equity, maybe 30%, 30 to 40% of the total development cost, but mostly it's funded by debt. And that's fine. People use debt to finance their construction. There are a number of different ways that the money can come to you. It can come from the big financial institutions, it can come from REITs, it can come from investment managers, it can be funded by retail banks, for example. Typically they'll go for smaller projects, but they can still fund these things. So this is what we talk about when we talk about finance for the built environment, debt finance typically. So what makes finance sustainable? Well, in short, it's money that has strings attached. And those strings are telling you what you need to do. Now, on what they call a vanilla loan, which is just a bog standard loan, you'll be given the loan, you'll be told, we want our interest here, we want this much interest, we want you to pay it back in these tranches, and that's that. That's a vanilla loan. They just don't tell you what to do with the money other than you're going to build this thing. But a sustainable finance loan, sustainable finance generally, is money given to you on condition that you do certain things, typically environmentally or socially beneficial to the wider community and the planet. Sometimes sustainable finance providers will also offer you preferential rates and discounts on your administration charges for what they perceive to be doing the right thing. And so within sustainable finance, you have this concept of an eligible use of proceeds. Now, the next slide is going to be something I've borrowed from the Climate Bond Initiative. And within their buildings criteria, they have what they call an eligible use of proceeds. And it's a term you hear often in the sustainable finance world. What is the eligible use of proceeds? Now, from the climate bonds perspective, they consider financing or refinancing of loans and mortgages, capital costs of upgrades and now developments they've done recently, and the operational expenses of ongoing maintenance where that reduces carbon emissions, increases energy efficiency. So that's what they call an eligible use of proceeds. Other organizations define things differently, and there's quite a lot of confusion in the market as to which rules we should be following to call something a sustainable bond. I'll come back to that in a little while. But not all sustainable finance bonds are necessarily environmentally sustainable. These are a whole load of different types of bond, and another word you might hear sometimes is impact finance, because the funding wants to create an impact on one of these headings here. So type of bond, vanilla, we've talked about, very, very straightforward. Green is typically focused on the environment. So social bonds are focused on social. Sustainability bonds, green and social. And there are lots of other types. Sustainability-linked bonds and sustainability-linked loans tend to be forward-looking and say we're going to move our organization from this position to a better performing position. Similarly, transition bonds do the same thing. They're intended to finance an organization to move from one situation to a better one from a environmental and social perspective. And then there are climate-focused bonds, which have a very narrow field, which is looking at climate change specifically. So people started issuing these bonds, and 5, 6, 7 years ago, the market started to emerge, and everyone was starting to say this is the next big thing. And so everyone wanted to call their bonds sustainable bonds, green bonds, whatever they were. But there was a lack of regulation, and it led to something of a Wild West, with all sorts of lenders calling their loans green or sustainable. And it wasn't helpful to the market to know where to put their money, because if they wanted to know somebody was doing the right thing, there was no guidelines to say, well, what does sustainable mean? And so we ended up with greenwashing, effectively. People were just saying, yes, this is green, but actually it's not. And so what that's led to the emergence of in the finance world is this idea of a sustainable finance taxonomy, which you may or may not have heard of. Now, the idea of a taxonomy in this context is, let's take the EU as an example, because they were one of the market leaders here. They said these are the definitions or the requirements for an investment to be called sustainable in our world. And they broke it down by industry and by sector and by activity type. So in the same way you have a taxonomy of living organisms, you have a taxonomy of activities which can be seen to be sustainable or not. And they provide quite clean definitions as to what is a sustainable act and what is not a sustainable act. And companies who report in the EU distinguish between the activities that are not sustainable, ones that are kind of trying to be, and ones that are really impactful and trying to do the right thing. So Article 6, 8, and 9. Now, these taxonomies help us prevent greenwashing. They help investors to make informed decisions. And you can imagine a time in the future when, once everyone's got the reporting sorted out, the policymakers can say, right, you need to have 10%, 20%, 30% of your balance sheet as sustainable. And then that encourages a transition towards a more sustainable economy and built environment. And these taxonomies also help to channel investment towards proper green activities rather than greenwashed activities. That's fine for there. One of the challenges in this space, though, is that it is beset with a huge number of acronyms. There are voluntary codes, mandated codes, different forms of taxonomies around the world. You have the PRI, GRESB, SFDR, TCFD, CBI. It becomes a whole world of requirements and regulations, and there's some work going on to try and standardize the language we use. But this slide is really designed to highlight that these taxonomies, these sustainable finance taxonomies, are being developed around the world. This slide is slightly out of date because the EU, for some reason, isn't coloured in. But the development is happening country by country. And so one of the challenges we have is that each country is doing their own thing. And money, unlike buildings, is very mobile. So you could have a building funded from Canada through South Africa into London, and you'd end up having to report under multiple jurisdictions. So you'd need to understand what they are. That's a slightly different conversation. We'll park onto that. The UK version of a taxonomy has been postponed yet again. It was first due 3 years ago, but we haven't actually got there yet. Hopefully the new government will do something soon. The EU are also working on a social taxonomy, not just an environmental one, but a social taxonomy as well. A slightly harder challenge, and that's why it hasn't quite emerged yet. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit now onto the EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy as it relates to buildings. So I mentioned earlier that the taxonomy describes what a sustainable activity is. Now, from the context of the built environment, we have, I think it's 6 or so categories. It covers the construction of new buildings, renovation of existing buildings, the acquisition and ownership of buildings, and then the installation and maintenance and repair of all of these different little things going on here. So it broadly covers the life cycle of the building until the end. There's a whole circular economy set of regulations that we don't need to worry about right here. These are the different sort of activities that the taxonomy explores. Now, while it's focusing in on the definition of these things and the characteristics they need to have, they also have a little footnote which says organizations must also align with the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, basically do the right thing from a human rights perspective. So there's a reporting requirement on reporting companies in the finance world to say that the investments they're making align with those requirements. So you can see how a supply chain with a small SME at the bottom may have some challenges around finding out what this information is. So just zooming in onto the construction of new buildings, for example, the requirements under construction of new buildings from the climate change mitigation perspective, and there are 6 categories: climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, the sustainable use and practice of protection of water and marine resources, transition to a circular economy, pollution prevention and control, and protection of biodiversity. So each of the taxonomy headings has 6 categories. You can have a major contribution in one of those categories and then they have this sort of mop-up thing called do no significant harm, where you have to demonstrate that in the other sectors you haven't actually had a negative impact. Now, climate change mitigation in the construction of new buildings, these are the criteria that you need to meet. They don't seem particularly onerous, but you'd be surprised how many organisations can't meet them. So the new building that you're creating must have a 10% lower than the definition for a nearly zero energy building, which in itself is a challenge to understand. And for larger buildings, you have to have a testness for airtightness and a whole life cycle global warming potential assessment calculated and disclosed. That's to encourage people to start reporting it, to build the information infrastructure we need to start doing that sort of thing. So that's the sort of climate change mitigation bit, relatively light touch. And then you've got a whole load of what they call do no significant harm data points under the other headings. I'm not going to get into the detail of those because I realized I'm rapidly going through the time here. But you can have a look at them on the slides as we go through it. Broadly, you just need to show that as well as doing the thing that you're trying to achieve, you're not having a negative impact on any of the other categories there. I will also skip through the renovation of existing buildings, other than to just highlight that you need to demonstrate a 30% reduction in primary energy demand when you do that refurbishment for it to be considered to be a sustainable investment or a loan in the building. So that's the context for sustainable finance. We are trying to create codes that define what a sustainable activity is, that attach to a loan, which is given to a developer or somebody else, and they then have to meet the requirements of those loans so that the funding company can report back and say, yes, our investments, our loans comply with the EU taxonomy or the Canadian taxonomy or wherever it is. Okay. Now, I mentioned at the very start my thesis, and it was about decision making in construction contexts, specifically in projects. But I've applied it in the next slide to the bank's lending decisions. Now, in a typical financial context, a given person making a loan decision is influenced by supranational legislation, their national laws, their own organizations, the shareholder views on what is the right thing to be doing, the bank itself drivers of value, and then you come down to the individual. They have their own personal drivers of value, so they will make decisions based on that. There's also a whole other set of drivers of value, such as the environment, which are often ignored in this decision, but the taxonomy is starting to bring those back into the conversation. Now, I've put this slide on here just to show the sort of hierarchical nature of the influences on the lending decision, and those will then influence the decision on what and how to build. Now, the world I found myself in when I was working in architectural design was between the lender and me was a client, a contractor, a novated design house, my employer, my team leader, and then there was me. I was desperate to effect change on projects, but I had all of these little arrows to fight back against. And so you might be lucky enough to have a client who wants to deliver more environmentally sound outcomes. It may be that they're being driven by the provider of finance to do the right thing, but whatever it is, the client wanting to do that goes down towards where the individual designer is. Part of why I decided to do my research program was because I got frustrated at not being able to affect the change. And I wanted to understand how I, in that little bottom right-hand corner, could affect the decisions in the bigger picture. Now, I'm not going to give you a 3-hour exposition of my dissertation right now. I'm going to give you 3 key themes, key ways that you can think about using these sorts of levers to drive change on your projects. Now, I'm presenting these very briefly, and I encourage you to either ask questions about them or to read through them later on. The final point here is something that you might want to explore a little bit more, because it's a really powerful tool when you're talking to investment managers and people who are in office estates. So 3 ways you can drive change in your project. You can use finance, the provision, as a lever for change. I'll go on to each one of these individually in a second. You can talk to your clients about the inevitable policy response that's coming and the risk of stranding. And that's a reflection of the fact that policy is coming. Do they want to be prepared for it, or do they want to just wait and see? And then the third tool is using the Carbon Risk Real Estate Monitor, or CREM tool. And this is a really powerful, not perfect, but powerful tool that gets the attention of asset managers quite quickly. So just jumping into those very quickly. Using finance as a lever for change. Now, we've seen today very briefly how finance, sustainable finance in particular, can impose requirements on funders of projects. Now, if you want to influence the project outcomes, you can have a look and think about what type of building am I creating, and then try and understand where the finance is coming from. Does their finance provider have ESG requirements that they need to meet, or sustainable finance requirements that they need to meet so they can report in a certain way? You try and understand the rules that might apply to that funder or fund, and then you can articulate your proposal for doing the right thing as you see it in the framework of one of those contribution areas, so climate change mitigation, improvement of biodiversity, circular economy, and all those sorts of things. So you can frame it and saying, well, this will help you achieve that particular outcome for your project, and that means you can align it with this particular significant contribution category. Now, I'm just going to jump very quickly back to the taxonomy, because one of the categories there is the acquisition and ownership of buildings. And I'm using this as an example of how you can use the sustainable finance world to influence change. If you acquire or own a building and money is loaned into that, it needs to have an EPC Class A certificate for it to be classed as a sustainable loan as an investment for that building, or it needs to be within the top 15% of performing buildings in that region. And so your client may have a building that they're looking at, and they're looking at having a little bit of a reshape of their portfolio. If they want to class that as a sustainable investment, it needs to have those criteria. And so you can say, well, actually, you might want to think about doing a significant retrofit to this building because you're not in that category, and it starts to drive behavior. So that's just one example. The second tool, the second lever, is to, if they're not interested in the whole finance conversation, if they're not taking sustainable finance, we just have vanilla funds, it's fine. You can then talk to your clients and supply chain about the preparations for the inevitable policy response. And I've put a little link at the bottom there to the website for the organization that deals with the inevitable policy response. The idea behind this is that we have had for quite some time the Paris Agreement, and that commits countries to achieving a trajectory down towards net zero by 2050. Ideally sooner, but that's what globally has been agreed. To deliver on that, countries have sort of put in place their sort of nationally declared contributions, and they're having pathway discussions as to how they're going to get there. The market is not going to respond on its own. It's not just going to do this. And so what that means is there's going to be an inevitable policy response. There will need to be policies put in place that impact on our day-to-day activities, especially in the built environment as 40% contributor to the carbon emissions in the world. That policy response then brings about the risk of stranded assets. I'll come a little bit more onto stranded assets going forward, but we've seen how oil, for example, is being discovered, but because of the climate commitments countries have made, we can't extract it. And these oil fields are considered to be stranded assets because they have these assets, but they're worthless because we can't take the oil out of the ground. Buildings are going to start becoming the same thing because there's no amount of money you can throw at them necessarily that will move them from where they are to another one. And we are starting to see buildings as just being abandoned basically because they can't be upgraded cost effectively. So that's level 2. The client might want to prepare themselves and their portfolio or the buildings that they're creating now for this inevitable policy response. If they've still got their fingers in their ears, you might want to then bring out the CREM stranding line, carbon risk real estate method stranding line. Now, I've got a couple of minutes to talk through this. But broadly, what we have here is on the left-hand side, emissions intensity and time going across the bottom there. And the green line is showing you the effective emissions intensity targets based on each country and sector's decarbonisation target. And so you might be familiar with that shape of curve from the Science Based Targets Initiative, for example, and CREM and the Science Based Targets have recently aligned their curves. And what this is saying is that over time, your sector and therefore your building will need to reduce its carbon emissions intensity along this pathway, dropping down to 2050 to get to the de minimis level that the country has set. And what you can do is you can use existing data to plot your asset portfolio onto this line and identify if it's above or below the line at a particular moment in time. Obviously, the ones that are above the line are already at risk of stranding because they don't meet with current policy in terms of baseline carbon performance. If they're on the line, in 3 years' time, they're going to be above the line. So time marching on means that existing buildings will become at risk of stranding because they are not performing as well as they could. And that's why the green line is called the stranding line. But what you can see on stranding number 1, when you do a retrofit, it drops carbon performance down to another level, which gives you a few more years. The question then becomes to your clients, how soon do you want your building to be stranded? How deep do you want your retrofit to be? How long lasting do you want that to be? And having a chart with a portfolio of dots all around there saying, well, these buildings up here, you're not going to be able to sell them because they're brown assets, then nobody's going to want them. And so they might have to start investing to bring the energy performance in line with what the market expectations are. As I said, this isn't perfect and there are some very specific challenges around it, which I won't go into, but it's a really useful visual tool and clients get it. Investment managers get it. So it's a helpful tool to have the conversation saying, we want to do this thing. We want to go deeper with this insulation. We want to make the windows more efficient. We want the detailing to be just right. So that's almost my half hour up. I'm going to give you a few takeaways. One is that you do have agency. You can achieve something. You might be that little person in the right-hand box of corner of that slide, but you can affect change by using the right levers. There are finance and policy levers that are either in place or coming that will allow you to effect change on your projects. You can help your construction clients meet their funders' requirements. They may not even know about them, but asking the question means that you can then start to engage in a conversation about how they can achieve that by doing things differently on their projects. And telling them that doing nothing is likely to create stranded assets risks for them is a very crystallizing idea for them. If they start to lose money, they will start to think about what they need to do to address that. So with that, I will leave you on a slide of the report that we put together, which covers some of these things. And there's a QR code there for you to download a copy if you'd like. And I'm happy to field any questions.
Thank you so much, Kel. That was a really interesting and looking at a lot of high-level finance applicability and how that feeds through to everything. So it's a quite a huge ecosystem, and as you mentioned, is going to be pivotal in regards to how policy is changing. Um, uh, by the way, please do ask any questions that you have within the chat box, but I'll start off. Really interesting point you mentioned on stranded assets. I've started to see, particularly the larger portfolio owners, start to move, having made decisions that a particular asset is probably not worth upgrading or investing that money in, and then moving to new build sites and things like that and disposing of those assets. So that'd be really interesting if you could elaborate on that a little bit more. And that's probably where most people are probably starting to see potential opportunities in regards to retrofit for more ambitious small scale developers. And it may even be where they're having to come in and advise some of their larger clients and come up with strategies in regards to what they like to do moving forward.
That's a huge question, but thank you for
Sorry,
it.
sorry.
No, it's absolutely huge. I mean, you touch on so many things. So there are several responses that you can have to potential stranding. One of those is just, I'm not interested, and sell it. You won't get the value that you want from it because it is an asset that needs investment. And so you are starting to see, as you say, people selling off these assets. That's not an ideal response because somebody will buy it and then they will operate it badly and it will just create bad outcomes for the planet. We also see investment managers starting to buy these brown assets that aren't achieving what they could do and then doing their retrofit. So there is a market for these buildings, a secondary or tertiary market for these buildings. But you're absolutely right in that retrofit is something that the market now needs to be coming to terms with. It's going to become an increasingly important sector within the market. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is, as just discussed, we need to be making our buildings more efficient and effective. So we need to be doing deep retrofits, deep energy retrofits. But the second issue, which we haven't really touched on other than brief mention on the circular economy, is that local authorities are becoming increasingly sensitive to construction waste, not just because of the need for putting it in a hole in the ground somewhere, but also the emissions that are associated with developing new buildings mean that creating the best building you have is the one you don't need to build. And so planning authorities are starting to say, no, you can't build a new building here. You have to adapt what you already have. We don't want to incur the waste that's being created by knocking down an entirely new building and the carbon emissions that relate to an entirely new one. So the dynamic is starting to change between whether you knock down and rebuild or whether you retrofit an existing building. And so, yeah, absolutely, it's a growing market. And I think in the next 10 to 20 years, that will become the dominant market sector for the built environment.
Great, thank you for that. Naturally, as you mentioned, retrofit, I'll probably touch on a bit about that. Obviously, we've got the PAS and retrofit guidance in regards to that that's been released, whether it be for residential or commercial. There's slightly different strands in regards to that, but very similar processes in place for looking at those. Typically, that again is larger developers and estate holders that are looking at that in a holistic manner because their estates are so huge, so they're coming up with strategies for that. And then furthermore, obviously, there's the murmurs in regards to Part Z and body carbon, which is making headway. And then I guess conjoined or slightly aside of that, we've got Letty as well, which has come out with higher standard suggestions that go beyond what the current approved regulations have allowed for, but with a view to having looked at more longer term changes that are going to be coming in due course, as you've quite rightly mentioned. Again, I know obviously I'm quite broad brush in regards to the question, but hopefully that gives you some additional food for thought in regards to answering some points.
Yes. It's quite hard for me to. There's lots of things in there. I'm not hugely familiar with the PAS retrofit guidance. I haven't got into the detail of that. My focus is much more on the finance world, so I haven't got into the detail of that. But yes, it's very important. And I used to work with an organisation called Useful Projects, and they effectively switched their workload to doing retrofits of buildings. So it's a very important and growing market. Part Z absolutely is becoming a thing. When I first started into the world of architectural design in around about 2005, the balance between operational and embodied impacts was sort of 70% operational, 30% embodied impacts. And the balance is shifting now because our buildings are becoming more energy efficient. The proportion of the carbon emitted by a building is becoming embodied carbon. And Part Z has been a conversation that's been happening for a while, driven by lots of good friends, as to how we can incorporate that into standards. And while it hasn't quite made it yet in the UK, I think the direction of travel is definitely towards having something that is regulated. We are starting to see in certain regions asking for an assessment of it. The EU is requiring it. The climate bond standard is requiring it now for new developments. The science-based targets have got something on it, and CREM have got something on it as well. So the embodied emissions for a building are becoming more important, and getting on top of understanding how that works is an important part of your work, and thinking about the embodied impacts of not just the development, but the operational impact and what happens at the end of life. Do we throw it away? Do we build new? Do we burn it? What happens there? On LETI, just a very quick one there, we've also got other standards like Passive House, and I can see a question there about BREEAM as well. We have LETI, we have Passive House, we have LEED, WELL, we have all these different certifications schemes, and they provide us with different levels of aspiration to do the right thing. It can be very confusing, and one of the other pieces of work that I'm trying to do is to say, let's just align the information asked at the building level so that the building reports what it needs to report to answer all of their questions, and then you can worry about the scheme that you're reporting to afterwards. But the ultimate thing we're moving towards is net zero from a carbon perspective, but also net biodiversity gain, no impact on water, and all those sorts of things. And so they have these requirements. The extent to which organizations want to align with those is entirely dependent on the client, and the client or the funder or the government, depending on how high up the hierarchy you go. And so LETI pushes the boundary. BREEAM, the new version, may well push the boundary a little bit further, but at the moment it's not had a refresh for a while. We've got the net zero building standard coming out shortly, which is another thing you'll be taking into account. And so everything is moving us in the direction of a better and better and better performing buildings and development process. And so as designers, you need to ensure that you know how to respond to those questions when they come. How do we deliver Passive House? How do we deliver net zero as a building? How do we minimize our embodied carbon? And if you can't answer those questions today, the market's going to be growing and growing and growing, and you may miss out on opportunities to be able to take advantage of that market.
Great. I'll jump to a couple of questions that have come in. So we've got sort of, I guess, almost, thank you, Jess and Ian, for your questions, but they're sort of very roughly on the similar strand. The questions are, if you can join them to a certain degree, is what is the inevitability in regards to the policy response, and how long do we see that taking to actually start taking effect in the built sector. And then I guess furthermore, it might be worth discussing. Again, I'm happy to sort of jump in as well if needed. For example, if we're looking at it from a UK's perspective, but also an international perspective, for example, the devolved nations, but also the EU, and then wider afield as well, and how do we see that being enforced for buildings that have yet to meet that standard? And what would be the outcome / the solutions for those?
Now, if you'd asked me that question 6 months ago, I would have just scratched my head and gone, with this government, I have no idea. They did away over the 14 years of their world with some very, very progressive policies in the UK. In 2016, we had the Code for Sustainable Homes. Sorry, 2012, we had the Code for Sustainable Homes, which would have given us net zero buildings by 2016. So we could have been building net zero homes for the last 8 years. They did away with that, and which means we've now got a whole load of homes tied in to fossil fuel technologies. We have a new government, and nobody really knows how they're going to respond. One would hope more positively. The key things that we're starting to see is minimum energy performances, and in the EU, the context you mentioned just a minute, in the EU, their new Energy Performance of Buildings Directive has put in place a mechanism for ratcheting the performance of buildings over time. And so that policy response is starting to kick in and will get faster and faster and faster. In the UK, we did have the minimum energy efficiency standard, and that is kind of vague and weak. What we have is a situation where the UK's climate change budget has been met quite easily so far. It's the next 10 years that are going to be a real challenge under the Labour government. And all I can say is I'm hopeful that they will be implementing the policies needed to get us to where we need to be in the next 10 years. But they will be quite challenging and hard hitting. So the EPCC is going to be a thing of the past, I'm guessing, and we're going to be moving to EPBB, EPCA relatively soon. But at the same time, we just don't know. So it's not an ideal question, an ideal answer, because we don't have the information. But I'm more hopeful than I was 6 months ago. Just on the question of BREEAM upgrades as well, there is a BREEAM upgrade coming out next year, and they are trying later this year, early next year, I can't remember, and they are trying to improve the aspirational level of that and the minimum levels as well. And so if you have planning authorities and clients who want a particular BREEAM rating for marketing purposes or for planning purposes, it is going to become harder to achieve those from next year. And so that will start to kick in, but it's creating more of a baseline than a target, unless the client wants to achieve those things, which is probably slightly above the building regulations. But the building regulations are also going to start ratcheting up over the next 5 to 10 years. In short, by 2030, we need to be building nothing that isn't zero carbon. That's how fast things need to change. Now, whether or not they put the policies in place to achieve that, again, I do not know.
Yeah, really interesting points. And also, obviously, as you've mentioned, the government have a lot to play in regards to a lot of power in regards to how this plays out to a certain degree. Obviously, there's international agreements that have been signed, which are binding to a certain degree. But it'd be really interesting to see how systems develop to be able to measure how upgrades can be done to buildings. And as you mentioned, things like passive house, BREEAM, retrofit, etc., how those actually come into looking at its individual buildings, and then obviously how then advice is given to sort of wider estate owners on how things can be done. and how that timeline is broken down, because obviously the one thing we've probably not touched on as much during this talk so far is obviously one can't expect someone to make all of the upgrades in one go. So there would have to be a timeline created in regards to upgrades,
And
and that might be something really interesting to touch on.
so there is this emerging idea of renovation passports. So don't get me started on building passports. I can talk about that for days. But this idea of a renovation passport for a building in which you assess the current condition of the building, and then you can use different tools to say, right, these are the interventions that you need to get from where you are down to where you need to be. These are the broad costs of those things. These are the cost-effective ones that you can do now. These are the more expensive and longer-term ones. And some of these renovation passports can provide you with a sort of pathway over the life of the building over the next 10, 15 years as to how you're going to get from where you are to where you're going to be and the broad cost of that. If anyone's interested in exploring these renovation passports in more detail, there's a project currently going on in the Netherlands called Demo Blog, I'll put it in the chat. And they are looking at multiple different building passport types, one of which is the renovation, and they're trying 2 or 3 different approaches to gathering the data. The key challenge is, though, when you're dealing with a portfolio of many, many, many small buildings, thank you for that, when you're dealing with a portfolio of many, many small buildings, the investigation time is high relative to the return that the person's going to get from doing that piece of work. And so capturing the information, doing an audit of the building is probably one of the most challenging things. That is another potential service offering that organizations might offer, especially people with the technical knowledge and skills that CIAT members do have.
Thank you so much for this. I know we've gone into very sort of detailed policy-based kind of discussion, but obviously, hopefully everyone can see how this then feeds into what everyone does on the ground day to day, and probably gives that factual understanding of why regulations are being cranked up almost on a yearly basis, and how things are seeming to change constantly. So it's really interesting, and I know Kell recently attended one of the I forget which one, but one of the talking events around the country. Which one was that, Kell, that you went to?
Well,
Yeah, circular economy. That was it.
Forum, yeah.
Yeah, circular economy forum. So it's actually something which is very topical at the moment, and lots of people are really interested in understanding how this is going to affect investment funding and development moving forward. And everyone will know buzzwords that then feed into it at some point, just like how we've mentioned BREEAM, Passive House, and so on. These are all things that then feed into that. So thanks for that, Kel. And whilst I have everyone's attention, I just wanted to highlight the events that we have coming up for the remainder of this year. So if I just quickly share my here we go. Yeah, so obviously we just had our talk from Kel, which has been greatly appreciated. We have that was the event for September. We have the following one, which is in October, is Earth Center Design, Working with Nature from Terra Lupa. Should be really interesting, looking at how interventions can be done to make sure that we're working with nature rather than against it. Then our November event would be a really interesting one, is from BSBG, and that's transition from 2D to 3D. Again, really interesting. I've seen some of the stuff that these guys have done before, so really, really interesting content. Advise you to register as soon as this is released. And then we've got our final event for the year will be blue green roofs with smart control devices, which is coming from Moy Materials. That again is going to be really interesting, presented by particularly the last two. They're going to be presented again by members of the Institute. So please do tune in. Regarding, just so you're aware, regarding our events for the calendar year 2025, we have virtually every single month planned out, with the exception of 3 or 4 months. That list will be circulated, I believe may have been circulated in some forums. So please do keep an eye out for that and book in for those. Obviously, you're all appreciated. Please do give us any feedback if you have any, if there's any ideas in regards to other events, please do let us know. We're open ears and are always looking for someone to come along to the CPD. Please do also make sure that you share this. I've been asked questions in the past where people are asking whether they can have a single login and share it company-wide. Please feel free. We're happy for you to have this up on the big screen with people watching, and please feel free to post questions that may be in the room that you're in onto the chat box so that we can answer them for you. And just a little bit of housekeeping is that we will be circulating the slides for the event to all the people who have signed up for it in subsequent correspondence. This, as usual, has been recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube in short order, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event.
Thanks.